At 2:13 local time, just east of the outbound lane in the Strait of Hormuz, the first radar returns would not look dramatic. A handful of low, slow contacts, then a second cluster, then a third, rising off the Iranian littoral and spilling out from the shadows of Keshem, Larak, and the approaches near Bandar Abbas. On the Combat Information Center screens of a U.S. Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, the pattern would become clear before the count became stable. These were not aircraft, not helicopters, not civilian traffic. They were one-way attack drones, flying low enough to complicate the horizon, cheap enough to be launched in volume, and numerous enough to turn the sea lane ahead into a moving wall of decisions. The ship would accelerate. Electronic warfare would come alive. The helicopter deck would stop being a flight deck and become a hazard zone. Every console in the combat system would shift from routine surveillance to triage, which tracks our real threats, which are decoys, which are leading the main body, which are designed only to make the destroyer reveal its firing doctrine. From the outside, it would look like a simple duel, one American destroyer against 1,000 suicide drones. But that is not the real story. The public version of the scenario is easy to understand because it flatters the visible layer. Tehran launches a spectacular swarm. The U.S. Navy answers with Aegis radar, guided missiles, rapid-fire guns, and cool professionalism. The destroyer either holds or it does not. It becomes a test of hardware, training, and nerve. But Hormuz has never worked that way. Blockades in this corridor are not decided by sinking the strongest warship in the area. They are decided by freezing commercial movement in one of the narrowest and most politically loaded maritime choke points on Earth. At its narrowest, the strait is only about 21 miles wide. The formal shipping lanes that organize most tanker traffic are far tighter. 2 miles for inbound traffic, 2 miles for outbound, with a 2-mile buffer between them. In peacetime, that geometry is manageable. In crisis, it becomes a targeting grid. And that leads to the real question underneath the title. Could a U.S. destroyer survive a 1,000-drone assault? Probably, at least long enough to remain in the fight. But could it, by itself, keep Hormuz open while that drone storm was only the visible cover for a much larger blockade architecture? That is the question Tehran would want everyone to miss. A modern Arleigh Burke is not a fragile target. Depending on the flight, it displaces around 9,000 tons at full load, carries a crew of more than 300, and can make better than 30 knots. Its center of gravity is not just the hull or the gun on the bow. It is the combat system, spy radar, Aegis architecture, vertical launch cells that can be filled with different mixes of interceptors and strike weapons, a 5-inch gun, close-in weapons, electronic warfare systems, decoys, sonar, helicopters. It is a warship built not merely to endure attack, but to sort chaos into engagement priorities faster than the enemy can weaponize confusion. That matters because a destroyer is one of the few ships in the world that can look at hundreds of air tracks and still operate as a fighting organism rather than a panic platform. It can track far more than it can physically engage at once. And in a swarm fight, that difference becomes everything. Tracking is not killing. Knowing is not solving. Now, consider the attack geometry. 1,000 suicide drones do not have to be launched from one runway or one base. That is a mistake people make when they imagine this as a single-wave cinematic strike. Iranian doctrine has long preferred layered, dispersed pressure, portable launch rails, truck-mounted racks, coastal revetments, island positions, civilian-looking support vehicles, small craft that do not look important until they stop, pivot, and begin unloading. A Shahid-type one-way attack drone is crude by high-end military standards, but that is precisely why it is dangerous in volume. Roughly 3.5 meters long, about a 2.5-meter wingspan, a warhead in a range of 40 to 50 kilograms, a noisy piston engine, and a speed that is slow compared to a jet but fast enough to close with a target if launched in numbers. Pre-programmed, expendable, and cheap enough that the attacker does not need tactical elegance. Only density. That cost equation matters. A one-way drone in that class can cost tens of thousands of dollars. The interceptor fired to stop, it can cost many times more. Not always. Not every engagement requires the most expensive missile. But once a destroyer begins spending vertically launched air defense missiles against mass low-cost targets, the exchange ratio starts favoring the side that can keep launching, and the destroyer does not carry infinite time or infinite cells. A Berk has 96 vertical launch cells, but those cells are not all waiting for drones. Some will be allocated to long-range air defense, some to anti-ship or land attack weapons, some to anti-submarine work. Loadout is mission-dependent, not magical. Even if the ship had a generous air defense mix, every shot matters because there is no casual reload at sea for that kind of fight. Once a missile leaves a cell, the arithmetic becomes permanent until the ship reaches secure replenishment point. This is where the structure begins to crack. 1,000 drones is not a challenge because each drone is individually impressive. It is a challenge because the engagement windows compress. Low, slow targets can approach from multiple bearings. Some may skim low enough to appear late against sea clutter. Some may stagger timing, so the swarm does not arrive as one pulse, but as an elongated pressure wave over hours. Some may be programmed to force a destroyer to pivot sectors repeatedly, exposing the difference between what it can see, what it can classify, and what it can kill before the next wave enters terminal range. The destroyer still has tools inside that problem. Medium-range interceptors for the outer layer. Shorter-range missiles for the inner layer. The 5-inch gun at proximity fuse rounds are available and the geometry works. Close-in defensive guns for the last seconds. Electronic warfare to jam, spoof, seduce, or at least complicate the drone's final approach. Decoys to draw seekers away from the ship's exact position. But none of those systems changes the central truth. Saturation is less about whether the ship has weapons. It is about whether the ship can preserve enough of them long enough to remain a guardian of the corridor instead of becoming a bunker floating in place, defending only itself. Because a destroyer in Hormuz is not there simply to survive. It is there to keep traffic moving. That is the part most people miss. The objective of a Hormuz blockade is not necessarily to send a U.S. destroyer to the bottom. The objective is to make tankers stop, insurers panic, ship owners delay sailings, and global energy traders start pricing in uncertainty by the hour. Roughly a fifth of the world's oil trade, by many assessments, still moves through this waterway. Even a short disruption can reverberate globally, and large commercial ships do not need to be sunk to become obstacles. One disabled tanker in a narrow lane, one burning merchant hull, one panic turn, one collision in a traffic separation scheme with almost no room for error. That is enough to turn a military engagement into a navigation shutdown. So imagine a destroyer performing brilliantly. It shoots down the first 40 drones, then another 60, then 30 more with guns and jamming and layered fires. The crew is disciplined. The radar picture holds. The ship remains intact. In the public imagination, that looks like victory. But what if the commercial traffic behind it has already slowed to a crawl? What if civilian captains see debris in the lane, smoke on the horizon, and intermittent warnings of additional contacts? What if insurers suspend cover for transits until the threat picture clarifies? What if one tanker master decides not to enter the strait without guaranteed escort, and the ships behind him follow? The destroyer can win tactically, and the blockade can still begin operationally. This is where Tehran's hidden logic would sit. The drone swarm is not necessarily the blockade. The drone swarm is the curtain in front of it. A real Iranian attempt to close or constrict Hormuz would almost certainly be layered. Drones overhead, anti-ship missiles ashore, naval mines where nobody wants them, fast attack craft probing edges of the lane, coastal batteries on the mainland and on islands positioned to threaten both shipping and the escorts protecting it, possibly submarines or midget submarine elements, contributing uncertainty below the surface. Add jamming, false signals, civilian traffic clutter, and the ability to launch from multiple points along a rugged coastline, and the picture changes from spectacle to system. Mines are especially important because they invert time. A missile strike is immediate and visible. A mine threat is persistent, ambiguous, and deeply psychological. You do not need to mine the entire strait to create paralysis. You need enough credible contamination in enough critical water that every transit becomes a gamble and every clearance operation becomes a public test of patience. Mine countermeasures are slow by design because speed is exactly what gets people killed. That means a destroyer fighting overhead may be buying minutes, while the real blockade weapon is buying days. And anti-ship missiles change the engagement logic again. Drones can saturate air defenses. Shore-based anti-ship missiles can exploit the moments after that saturation, when offenders are forced to decide whether to conserve interceptors for higher-end threats or continue spending them on cheaper targets. If those missiles are mobile, hidden, and tied to dispersed sensors, the destroyer is no longer just shooting at inbound tracks. It is being pushed into a magazine management crisis. This is why the structural vulnerability is not the ship's courage or even its radar. It is a mismatch between a finite magazine and an almost infinitely renewable cheap threat ecosystem close to the attacker's own shore. The defender must be right repeatedly. The attacker only needs to create a few openings at the right time and in the right place. What if 1,000 drones were never intended to hit the destroyer in 1,000 direct lines? What if they were meant to fragment the ship's attention, draw out its emissions, force it to reveal firing patterns, and pull every eye in the combat information center upward while the actual closure tools move laterally across the map? That is where the phrase blockade becomes more important than the phrase drone attack. Vice Admiral Brad Cooper understood the maritime version of this problem long before a headline ever compressed it into a duel. The logic behind the U.S. Fifth Fleet's push into man-on-man teaming was simple. More eyes on the water, more persistence in contested spaces, more awareness of the small and the ambiguous before those small things become strategic problems. Captain Joe Baggett, describing these operations, made the same point in quieter language. Unmanned underwater vehicles, unmanned surface vessels, unmanned aerial systems, layered into routine patrols, expand presence without demanding a warship in every square mile in the waters around Hormuz. That matters because the threat is rarely a single dramatic object. It is the accumulation of suspicious movement. That is a hidden variable on the American side, and it changes the equation. A destroyer is not really alone, even when the title says it is. In a real crisis, it would be part of a kill web that extends far beyond the visible horizon. Unmanned surface vessels tracking small craft, UAVs extending line of sight, maritime patrol aircraft pushing sensor coverage outward, signals intelligence listening for launch preparation, helicopters hunting the boats that do not belong where they suddenly appear, airborne fighters taking intercepts at longer range, so the ship does not have to spend close defense on every inbound target, submarines or strike aircraft threatening the launch network itself, mine countermeasure forces preparing to move the moment the first indication becomes actionable. And that means the most important decision for the destroyer's captain is not how to kill the maximum number of drones. It is how to avoid fighting the wrong battle. At 2:23, the first wave might still look manageable. At 2:31, the picture could begin splitting into altitude bands and approach sectors. At 2:38, if additional tracks appear from a new bearing, the destroyer's role changes from point defense to corridor command node. At 2:46, the question is no longer, can we survive this wave? It becomes, what are they moving underneath it? That changes weapon choices. Not every drone earns a missile. Not every track can be treated equally. Jamming rises in value. Spoofing rises in value. Guns in close defense are held for leakers. Airborne interceptors matter more because they can kill cheaper and farther. The destroyer may deliberately preserve vertical launch cells for the possibility that the real threat is still behind the swarm. That restraint can look dangerous in the moment. It can also be the difference between holding the sea lane for another hour and going tactically blind against the second act of the attack. Because the second act is where blockades become wars. If the United States decides that the drones are only a masking layer for mines and shore-based missile fire, then restoring transit cannot remain a defensive mission for long. Mine warfare forces clearance. Missile launchers force suppression. Fast attack craft bases force strikes. Command nodes, radars, and logistics hubs suddenly become operational targets. The moment Washington concludes a Hormuz is under deliberate closure rather than episodic harassment, the map expands from a strait to the Iranian coast and from a maritime incident to a regional campaign. That is the escalation risk Tehran counts on, and the one Washington tries hardest to control. Iran does not have to believe it can defeat the U.S. Navy in open battle. It only has to believe it can raise the restoration cost, widen the target set, and force the Americans to choose between accepting disruption or escalating onto the mainland. In that space between inconvenience and war, oil markets move first, then diplomacy, then military reinforcement. And reinforcement changes timing again. A single destroyer on station today is not the same problem as a reinforced maritime package 24 hours later. More escorts, more aircraft, more surveillance, more mine warfare assets, more regional cooperation, more opportunities to strike launchers before they fire and expose mine layers before they seed the lane. What matters in the opening hours is not only present force, but arriving force. Tehran's best chance sits in the interval before the full network closes around the battle space. That is why 1,000 drones, if they were ever launched, would be less a kill mechanism than a clock. They would be there to consume minutes, missiles, and attention at the very moment the blockade architecture needs room to unfold. That architecture does not have to be permanent to be effective. 48 hours of credible closure pressure in Hormuz would be enough to shake energy markets, reroute shipping schedules, and force governments into emergency consultations. 72 hours would feel global. And yet even then, the visible drama would remain misleading. Viewers would see missile launches from a destroyer, tracer fire at night, perhaps the flaming remains of drones falling into the sea. They would think the contest was between machine and machine, hull and swarm, crew and chaos. But the deeper contest would be between posture and escalation posture. The destroyer's visible power is extraordinary. Its hidden vulnerability is that it cannot be everywhere, shoot forever, or guarantee commercial confidence by itself. Iran's visible power in this scenario is the swarm. Its hidden vulnerability is that the moment the blockade becomes undeniable, it invites a counter-campaign against every launcher, every small boat cluster, every mine track, every emitter that supported it. One side is stronger in open battle. The other is stronger in ambiguity and compression. So could U.S. destroyer beat 1,000 suicide drones in Hormuz? If beat means survive, absorb, shoot effectively, and remain a combat-capable platform, yes, very possibly. That is exactly the kind of disciplined violence such ships are built to deliver. If beat means single-handedly keep the strait open while 1,000 drones are only the first layer of a hidden blockade, the answer changes. No destroyer, no matter how advanced, wins that alone. Not because it is weak, but because Hormuz is not a dueling ground. It is a system, a 2-mile lane inside a global economy, a narrow body of water where cheap weapons, civilian traffic, island geography, insurance panic, mines, missile batteries, and political timing all converge in the same few hours. That was always the real danger. The destroyer is the visible shield. The blockade lives underneath it. And if Tehran ever tried to hide the second inside the first, the opening explosion would not be the most important moment. The most important moment would be the one after it, when commanders have to decide whether they are still defending transit or beginning a wider war. That is the difference between a dramatic attack and a strategic event. One is what the cameras would catch. The other is what the map would remember. What matters in Hormuz is never just what is already in sight. It is what is waiting behind the next wave, below the surface, along the coast, and just outside the first frame of the crisis. If you value this kind of strategic breakdown, subscribe and watch the next one.